Just a sec. Yeah. Okay, we are live. Great. Well, as I was mentioning, thank you very much for having joined the class. Always a pleasure. And great. Let us go then with our practice, okay? Let me share my screen with you. And I have here prepared all the resources we're going to use today in order to practice for this task. As I told you yesterday, the only thing we have to do is to listen to a lecture delivered by a professor, and then we simply have to, well, prepare a summary about that lecture, making sure to include all the illustrations that professors normally introduce in their lectures. And with that, we are done. We can, of course, summarize it without any other type of difficulty, given that, as I say, this fourth task is very much similar to the ones that you have been practicing before. So, well, we are not here in foreign waters, let's say. This is very much normal for us. Great, here we are. So let us go with the first lecture. If you're ready, I'm gonna reproduce this lecture. Remember that it is about 2 minutes long, something like that. It's 2 minutes and 30 seconds normally. And before I do this, I just remembered, let me show you once again the template or the structure. Here I have it. And then we'll start. Here it is. Okay. Okay. Here it is. Remember, in this lecture, right? First step, in this lecture, we've been presented to the fascinating topic of, and here you introduce your topic, and of course, the definition or the clarification of the topic that the professor normally delivers at the beginning of the lecture, because as I told you yesterday, it is as if professors were following some sort of pattern when they are delivering this lecture. So they always start with a clarification or definition of the topic for the entire lecture, and then they continue delivering some examples and illustrations for the students to understand that topic better. So remember that your first step will always be to clarify that topic as the professor does, okay? So then you continue the first lecture's point and illustration, second lecture's point and illustration, third lecture's point and illustration. Here, remember, if the professor mentions 4 or 5 illustrations, try to mention them all. Of course, having to always think about the time, measuring by yourself. In this case, it's way easier because all your concentration is going to be centered on the entire lecture, right? As well, of course, opposed to the third task in which you have to also think about the reading section. Now, it's just a matter of measuring your time and summarizing the entire lecture. Okay, so let's start and let us go with the first lecture.
Now, listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Let's talk about 2 kinds of biological selection. 2 different ways that traits are selected in a species of animal as it breeds and reproduces. First, there's natural selection. Here, living things develop features that help them survive in a certain kind of climate, escape from a certain kind of predator, that sort of thing. In contrast, we have artificial selection. Artificial selection happens outside of what we'd call nature. It happens when people deliberately breed living things for their own use. Now, it's true that natural selection and artificial selection both give a living thing the traits it needs to reproduce and survive. But these 2 types of biological selection also have very different effects, obviously. Maybe one of the easiest places to see this difference is with wolves and dogs. Let's start with wolves. So, what's a wolf's job? It's to survive in the wild and get enough to eat, right? So certain qualities are naturally selected. Wolves need keen senses so they can detect prey. They need to be fast, strong, and aggressive to catch their prey, and to survive even in the harshest weather. Wolves that are born with these qualities live longer and pass the qualities on to their pups. That's natural selection. But a dog's job, its role in its environment, is a little different. Dogs don't need to survive in the wild. They need human protection. So to survive, a breed of dog needs to have traits that humans want. Take the golden retriever. People bred a dog big enough to be a good hunter, but not so big that it was hard to control. And it had to be obedient, unlike a wolf, right? A golden retriever has to be, well, friendly in order to be well-liked enough that we humans decide to breed it, so we can get similarly friendly puppies, more pets.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain the two types of biological selection.
Great, there we are. So, dear students, it's now your turn to prepare your responses. Let me please enable here the chronometer, and then we'll start with the first responses round, okay? Very good, here we are. So, all of you please can start preparing your responses for this question now. Okay. The time is over. So it's now, in this case, I would like to listen to Claudia. Okay, please, dear Claudia, you're going to be the first one responding this question. So you can turn on your microphone. And you can please start responding this question now.
In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of selection in biology. So there are two kinds of selection. The first one is natural, that is that animals develop characteristics to survive. And the other is the artificial, that is not very related to the nature, but they develop characteristics also transmit to the pets. So the teacher present two examples of this. For example, wolves that survive because the natural where they live is wild, so they have to develop qualities to survive. And the dogs that don't need to survive but need human protection, like the golden retriever, has to be obedient and friendly.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Claudia. Very good. And now let me please follow up with Elsa. Okay, please, dear Elsa, you can start responding this question now.
Okay. According to the lecture, that there was a fascinating topic about biological selection. There are two types of selection: natural selection that refers to the wild animals, and they can reproduce and survive themselves. And artificial selection refers to the animals that are domestic animals, like pets that need human protection. For example, in the wild, in the nature selection, there are like wolves that they can protect and survive themselves. And in the artificial selection are like dogs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elsa. Great. I think that Romaneth got out, right? Well, I think she's going to come back soon. Okay, great. So let me start with some feedback for both of you. Let me go with Claudia first. So very good, Claudia. I think that your response was very good. You mentioned certainly a very good clarification of the topic right at the beginning of your response. You said this was about two types of natural selection. The first one, natural itself, that is to say, like, as you yourself explained, for animals that live in the wild and of course need to survive and reproduce, and that's all. And also artificial selection that works for animals that are also worried, let's say, or their objective, their primary objective is also to please human beings. And then you also talked about how the professor gave two examples, wolves and dogs. Very good. You are following the structure that way because you are mentioning the illustrations, right, that the professor gave. And very good, you mentioned them both. Now, very good with regard to your measurement of the time as well. I would say it was good. You had time in order to mention all the main points and ideas of the lecture. As I say, try to measure by yourself this. You can, for example, let's say you dedicate 10 or 15 seconds to the clarification or definition of a topic, and then you can spend 20 and 20 for both illustrations. It depends on you. Try to measure by yourself and try to organize your time in the best possible manner for you, in the manner or way that suits you the better. Okay, very good. And then with Elsa as well, very good response. You in this case, I like that you also mentioned a lot of, different ideas and elements in the lecture. You try to simplify them in your own words. So that's great, because as I told you before, a summary does not necessarily have to copy every single expression from the professor as he said it, but you can actually reinvent it or basically rephrase it with your own terms and ideas, and that's great. Of course, making sure to respect the information as you receive it, but the only thing you're doing here is that you are expressing that with other words, and that is totally legal. It's totally fine to do. And you did that because you were mentioning both of these ideas, but with words of your own. When you talked about domestical animals, for example, as well, and you talked about wild animals, very good. I think it was a great summary as well. You mentioned all the main ideas, and that's very good. It's a very good practice that we can always implement into our summaries, that when we listen to something that seems complex to explain with those same expressions, what we can do instead is to simply take that and to simplify it on our mind and to deliver it as we consider to be easier. Okay, very good. Let's go with another practice. We have a bunch of them. So let's continue with another lecture. Okay. Here I have the second one for you. Then we go with it. Okay, great. Well, it's our time to listen to this new lecture, so we can start now.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
In the 8th century BCE, a legendary author named Homer wrote 2 epic poems. You probably know them already, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're fascinating poems, really, partly because they give us such a clear window to the culture of the time. But what culture or what period of Greek history was Homer describing? His own era or an earlier one? It's an interesting question, but it's very likely there's no real answer. You see, Homer was working in the oral tradition. Before he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey down, poems were told and retold by generations of storytellers. Each generation added details to the poems, so it's likely that these poems are actually this. They're an interesting mixture of historical details about a bunch of different time periods. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one. Homer describes helmets made out of boar tusks. Well, just these kinds of helmets have actually been discovered in sites dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE in Greece. They weren't used in later time periods. That's a pretty clear indication, right? So clearly Homer's poems preserved some authentic details about the distant past, and some would argue that's the era Homer intended to write about. But then we take a look at another detail and it's a bit more nebulous. Homer describes chariots, horse-drawn wagons carrying warriors into battle. He describes them as simply carrying troops on and off the battlefield. That might be how chariots were used in Homer's time, sure, but in earlier history, the time when those helmets might have been used, say, they were used in battles themselves. The chariots, that is. So this is a good example of Homer adding details from his own world into the poems.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain why the professor thinks there is no real answer to the question of what period of history Homer described.
Okay, very good. So let me please continue with the process. And now you have 20 seconds to prepare those responses, okay? So please, you can start doing so now. Okay, great. Let us go with Elsa's response in this opportunity. Please, dear Elsa, you can start responding to this question now.
Okay, according to the lecture, the topic was about literature class, how poems reflect some kind of living of the past or the history or the culture aspect of the past in the especially from those of the earlier history. For example, Homer wrote some poems about very detailed poems that describe some way of living of the past time, and that is how Hammer show something about past in his poems.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, dear Elsa. Great. Okay, great. And now let us continue with Claudia. Please, dear Claudia, you can deliver your response for this question now.
In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of two poems written by Homer in the Greek Asian. So the professor was talking about how these poems can tell about the culture of their time. So people are trying to discover of when were write these poems, but it's a trick. It's tricky because they are from oral traditions, so storytellers add details from their own time, so they pass through the generation. So, for example, they present two examples of battles that they are different and the manufacturer. So,
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia. Great, very good. So let us start then with the feedback. Great, so I'm gonna go with Elsa first. Great, Elsa. I think that this lecture was very interesting. Personally, I love it because it talks about history, and as I told you guys, I love history as well. And well, Homer was a very interesting quotation. We know that. And in this case, the professor was discussing two of his very famous poems, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. Very enjoyable books. The point is that the professor has described in this opportunity, right? Oh, yes, you do? Oh, great, Claudia. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, as I say, it's like very good when the topic is very handy to our own, of course, set of skills, when we are very much knowledgeable of a particular subject. Fantastic. If this happens to us on the exam, we are just getting lucky, right? Well, as I say, it's like Omer was talking about different stories in these poems. And the thing that troubles different specialists on this area, according to the professor, is that they do not know what times was what times was Homer describing in these poems. That was, let's say, the main idea of the lecture. That's what the professor tried to say at the beginning, that although nobody doubts or hesitates that Homer wrote incredible pieces of well, let's say, literary, well, storytelling, the problem is that they do not know if he was describing or trying to describe his own time, or let's say a more antiquitous. Well, antiquitous. He was trying to describe the antiquity. Sorry. So well, the point is that he said, well, there are some hints or clues for us in some of his poems he has written about, and these were the two examples, right, that the professor described. In one of these poems, Homer was writing about helmets, and these helmets were apparently not, well, he was describing some helmets, and the material, according to Homer, that these helmets were made of was not the actual material that Homer's, let's say, well, that was, let's say, was the material that these helmets had were not the material that people utilized in order to construct helmets in Homer's time. And in the second point, the professor also said that there were some caveats in Homer's descriptions, and these caveats were bringing people in the battlefield and out of the battlefield. And the professor says that in this time, in Homer's time, it was the particularity that, these caveats did not actually bring people in or out of the battlefield, but they merely, helped to mobilize those troops. So the point is, as you can see, that in some poems, it would seem as if Homer were describing his own time, because as I say, in the first example, Homer was talking about helmets that were made of a particular material of his own time, and that would somehow suggest to us that, hey, he's writing about his own times. But then we listen to these other details about chariots bringing troops in and out of the battlefield. And apparently, during Homer's time, this was not done any longer, but this very much, as I say, antiguous purpose was part of a very, very old civilization that was not Homer's time. Therefore, as I say, what the professor tries to make in this case is to make his students feel some sense of contradictory statements, right? Because at some points, Homer seems to describe stories and events that pertain to his own time, but in other opportunities in the chariots, right? He somehow tells or expresses some details that were not of his particular time in history. So that is basically the idea, right? And I think that both of you portray that very well in your own terms. As I say, it's not always necessary, of course, to copy every single word the professor has said, but with your own words, I think you have managed to include that. In Elsa's response, for example, she talked about how Homer undoubtedly created fantastic works of art, as the professor said at the beginning. And then she also talked about how these poems seem to reflect the past. Well, in this case, maybe, I didn't listen too much to this, let's say, contradiction that the professor tried to create, right? Saying, hey guys, well, at some points, Homer seems to really indicate that his stories and poems are about his time, but in other poems, it seems the other way around, right? Maybe the mention of that particular topic or idea in the passage was not present this time in your response. But anyways, as I say, it's a matter of catching, right, the idea. And sometimes the idea is very complex. And it's a little bit difficult to catch, but many of the main ideas are certainly in your response. It was also great anyways. And Claudia, in your case, as you said, well, you are teaching this, so certainly you got the idea of this apparently, of this apparently contradiction, right? In Homer's poems. And you said very good that many of these contradictions seem to be caused because Homer wrote based in oral traditions. And as you said, oral traditions are always a very much unreliable source of historical information because they are, as you indicated, and as the professor indicated, especially, right, because this was not something that you brought to the table, but the professor brought it to the table, that people, of course, always add and they augment some details of his own time to those stories, and they retell them so that until the last person who receives that information, of course, is going to add more information to that story. And you summarized that very well. And maybe you didn't have time to mention the two examples, right, of the helmet, as I say, was made of a material that was not present in Homer's time, or you didn't talk about the carrots. But yeah, maybe you took too much time describing the idea. But as I say, it was very important in this case because the entire lecture fluctuated in that idea of the contradiction, the sense of contradiction that the professor was trying to create. But maybe, as I say, you can try to reduce a little bit your time. You can maybe actually, as I told you, try to dedicate 20 seconds maybe to the definition, 20 for the first illustration and 20 for the second illustration. You can try to make that combination. But as I say, try to measure it by yourself. But let us try to reduce a little bit the time you are expending on the definition to, of course, give us more space to the illustrations, okay? But anyways, it was great. And also, as I say, even although that particular idea was not present in the summary, it was also very good because you mentioned several of the main ideas. Okay, great. Very good. Let us go with another example. Let's go with lecture on science, if I'm not wrong, but let's see what this is about. Okay, let's go with a third one. Here we are. Let's go.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a physical science class.
So, in the early 20th century, there was this big debate going on in the scientific community. Did very small stuff like electrons behave like particles? Or did electrons, these negatively charged things that whirled around the nucleus of the atom, did these electrons actually behave like something else? Well, for a long time, it was assumed that because electrons were discrete, because electrons seemed to be individual objects with specific energy levels, for a long time it was assumed that electrons were simply small particles. But then, the double-slit experiment happened. In the double-slit experiment, electrons are shot at a screen containing two long vertical holes. The positions of the electrons after they go through the screen are captured on film. Now, experimenters expected that the results of the experiment would be simple, because, well, they thought that electrons were like small particles. They guessed that the electrons that went through the two slits would create a pattern of two narrow bands, or lines, on the film. However, this is not at all what the experimenters saw. Instead, they were shocked that the electrons formed an interference pattern, one by one, on the film. Now, in other words, the electrons randomly scattered all over the film in a wave-like pattern, instead of collecting in two narrow bands and creating the pattern that particles would make. So, the double-slit experiment was significant because it forced scientists to rethink the nature of electrons. They realized that electrons, like light, have characteristics of both particles and waves. Like particles, they collected one by one on the film. But like waves, they formed a complex interference pattern on the film, instead of forming two neat lines. And the results of the experiment? Well, they're discussed, debated, and reproduced to this day.
Using points and examples from the talk, describe the double-slit experiment and explain why the professor thinks that it is significant.
Great. Very interesting lecture as well, right? I see that Romaneth has also joined us. Would you like to repeat this lecture, guys, so that Romaneth listens to it as well? Let's see. Yes. Okay, great. So let us repeat it just for this time, okay? I know it was a little bit difficult, so... Oh, but Romaneth has just left again? Oh, no. In this case, Elsa has left us. Okay. Great. So let's listen to it once again, all right?
Now,
Romaneth, you can also take your notes. We are practicing for the fourth task, so please try to take a piece of paper, a pencil, and listen very carefully to this lecture that is on a very interesting topic about physics. So please let us listen to this, okay?
listen to part of a lecture in a physical science class.
So, in the early 20th century, there was this big debate going on in the scientific community. Did very small stuff like electrons behave like particles? Or did electrons, these negatively charged things that whirled around the nucleus of the atom, did these electrons actually behave like something else? Well, for a long time, it was assumed that because electrons were discrete, because electrons seemed to be individual objects with specific energy levels, for a long time it was assumed that electrons were simply small particles. But then, the double-slit experiment happened. In the double-slit experiment, electrons are shot at a screen containing two long vertical holes. The positions of the electrons after they go through the screen are captured on film. Now, experimenters expected that the results of the experiment would be simple, because, well, they thought that electrons were like small particles. They guessed that the electrons that went through the two slits would create a pattern of two narrow bands, or lines, on the film. However, this is not at all what the experimenters saw. Instead, they were shocked that the electrons formed an interference pattern, one by one, on the film. Now, in other words, the electrons randomly scattered all over the film in a wave-like pattern, instead of collecting in two narrow bands and creating the pattern that particles would make. So, the double-slit experiment was significant because it forced scientists to rethink the nature of electrons. They realized that electrons, like light, have characteristics of both particles and waves. Like particles, they collected one by one on the film. But like waves, they formed a complex interference pattern on the film, instead of forming two neat lines. And the results of the experiment? Well, they're discussed, debated, and reproduced to this day.
Using points and examples from the talk, describe the double-slit experiment and explain why the professor thinks that it is significant.
Okay, great. Well, we repeated this for Romanet, but she left us again, right? Anyways, I hope that you had the opportunity to listen once again, as I say, just for this time, because I don't want you to get used to this. Sadly, it didn't happen to me on the exam, that you have the opportunity to listen to twice, and it's not going to happen to you as well. Yeah, Elsa, you have a question? Please tell me.
Yes, teacher.
Mhm.
At the end of this lecture, I have written a question.
Yes.
Maybe, but we are trying to summarize the lecture. Why
Yes.
don't we answer the question? That's my question.
Yes. Well, if you listen to the question, look at it. It says, using points and examples from the talk, describe the double slit experiment and explain why the professor thinks that it is significant. When you think about this question, all it does is basically asking you to summarize the lecture, right? Because it's telling you, okay, describe the double slit experiment. And description is basically part of a summary, right? When you're summarizing something, you are describing it. You're describing what material or content was present in a particular information source. And later it says, explain why the professor thinks that it is significant. So if you notice, what it's basically telling you is that, well, you have this information, you receive it from the professor, and what we want you to do is to tell us what he said about double slit experiment and also what he considers to be, of course, the final conclusion. So, well, when you think about it, my desire is to make it as simple as I can make it for you. And if you think about it, it's just summarizing, right? It's just summarizing the entire lecture. It's not asking you something else. It's not asking you for the opinion. If that were the case, of course, the question would say something like, and also explain what you think about the experiment, or add some sort of information you may think to be significant. But sadly, any of the questions in the fourth task of the speaking section ask us to do something like that. The only thing they ask is, well, explain this, that is, of course, part of the summary, part of the lecture, and explain what the professor says about that. Basically a summary. That's the reason why I never ask you to read the question. But if you can, well, read it and try to maybe, if you want, emphasize on these points, but basically it's just doing exactly the same. Yeah, is that fine, dear Elsa?
Yes, thank you. That's okay.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Elsa. Great. So let's go with the answer, okay? Here we have it. Let's go with the 20 seconds for preparation. And you can please start responding. Well, not responding in this case, preparing your responses now. Okay, very good. Now, let us start with the responses. Dear Claudia, you're going to go first, okay? So please, you can start responding to this new question now.
In this lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of electrons. So in the 20th century, we had a debate in the scientific community about the electrons' behavior, like if it behaved like particles, and they developed an experiment, the double slit experiment, that show show electrons' behavior and capture that on film. So it's important because it make rethink the nature of electrons for the science. So it shows that electrons behave like both particles and waves. The particles have two narrow bands, and the waves with an interference pattern. So electrons have the particularities of both.
Okay. Great. Very, very good. Thank you very much, Claudia. And now let's go with our dear Elsa. Okay, please, dear Elsa, you can start responding to this question now.
Okay, in this lecture, we have been presented about a fascinating topic in the 20th century about his scientific community, talking about electronics, electrons, which works with small particles, and they made some kind of double slit experiment and noticed that electrons interference patterns and there are two types of electrons. One type that creates particles, that works with particles, and another one that works with waves.
Okay. Great. Very good. Thank you very much. Dear Elsa, great. There we are. So, very good. I think that both of you have fantastic responses for this round as well. Let me start with Claudia. So great, Claudia. I think that you certainly got the main ideas in your summary. In this case, the lecture was about physics, and the professor described particles and also waves, as we are told, right? That is to say, electrons. Now, the professor starts by saying electrons in the scientific community were considered particles at the beginning because they behave like them. They were organized in very simple and straight lines, and they also behaved as individual objects. That is basically the definition of a particle. And afterwards, scientists were performing an experiment on these electrons that was called the split experiment, that consisted in throwing these electrons to some sort of a screen with two different holes and catching the results of these electrons when they went through the second hole. And what they discovered was that these electrons didn't actually behave like straight lines. They were not organized in the straight lines, but they were organized following a wave pattern. So that made scientists to comprehend that although certainly electrons are particles, they behave like particles, they also behave like waves. That is to say, they follow a different pattern of organization when they are grouped into different sets. And that is what the conclusion of the professor is, that electrons are basically particles and waves at the same time, because they behave and they exhibit characteristics and features that pertain to both of these objects, waves or elements, waves and also particles, right? That's the conclusion. The final thing that the professor exhibits is that, well, waves and also particles are, let's say, categories in which electrons could be placed, okay? That is the idea, that electrons are, at the same time, particles and also waves. Very good. And I think that you mentioned that very clearly, dear Claudia. You talked about how at the beginning in the scientific community, they also believed that electrons were merely particles. Then you talked about the experiment, and you talked about how, of course, they noticed this wave pattern, and that determined a new conclusion for the scientific community. Very good, dear Claudia. It was very good this time. You took more time to describe the illustration. In this case, of course, there's just one illustration, right? That is, well, in this case, the double split experiment. Very good. And then also as well, you talked about how these electrons were considered particles at the beginning, but now, or well, then with this new experiment of the double slit experiment, scientists discovered that they were actually following an interference pattern, and that somehow allowed them the status of being also waves, right? Maybe you did understand this case that the professor said there were two types of electrons. That is not like specifically what he said. He said that they exhibited both type of characteristics and features, right? That they were behaving as if they were particles and waves, but he didn't say that there were two types of electrons. Maybe it was, as I say, sometimes we miss a word, and that word, of course, means something very different, right? But don't worry if this happens to you. They know that, as I say, when we are just listening to 2 minutes of something, it's very much normal and usual that we get ideas that are not exactly as the professor said them. And they are very much comprehensible with that, don't worry. Because as I say, this normally happens because it's just 2 minutes. If they were giving us, let's say, talks of 15 minutes, that time will be sufficient for us to identify the idea very clearly, because we will have more context, but they are giving us very, very low and little context in this case. So it happens very normally that we just get a wrong idea sometimes, but that's okay, don't worry. You got definitely the main ideas, and we can improve a lot, right, by practicing. Very good, dear Elsa. All right, awesome. So let's continue with one more. Let's go to the fourth one. Let's see what you can do in this one. Oh, sorry. Okay, please, your students, start listening to this new lecture now.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
Since the time of Aristotle, thinkers have struggled to define the nature of tragedy. You see, in classic literature, a classic tragedy is more than simply a story about an unfortunate occurrence. No, it's much more than that. A classic tragedy is a story about how a heroic person struggles to find happiness. But they somehow have a terrible flaw that negates the possibility of their happiness ever coming about. Nevertheless, tragic heroes will often accept responsibility for their downfall, admitting where they have been at fault. The audience experiences a sense of release or catharsis when they see the transformation of the characters and the nobility of their decision to accept responsibility in even the darkest circumstances. Aristotle believed that Oedipus Rex by the playwright Sophocles was one of the greatest tragedies ever written. It contained all the elements of a classic tragedy: an unsuccessful search for happiness, a tragic flaw, an acceptance of responsibility for one's faults, and catharsis. Oedipus is a heroic man who is quick-witted, strong, and ambitious. He sets out in the world to find happiness. However, his tragic flaw is pride. His pride leads him to kill a total stranger on the road. It also leads him to successfully answer the riddle of the Sphinx, a legendary monster. In gratitude for his achievement, the people of Thebes make Oedipus the king, and he marries the widowed queen of the city. However, a plague soon comes to Thebes, brought on by the anger of the gods. Oedipus eventually finds out that he is the reason for the plague. The stranger that he killed on the road was his father, and the woman that he married was his own mother. The play ends in sadness and disaster as Oedipus blinds himself and his mother commits suicide. However, before this happens, Oedipus apologizes for his pride and takes responsibility for all that happened, leading the audience to experience catharsis, a sense of release, thanks to his heroism in the face of suffering. No wonder Aristotle praised the play so highly.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain why the professor thinks that Oedipus Rex meets the definition of a classic tragedy.
Well, delightful philosophy. I love it. Well, let's go with the preparation time. Dear students, you can please start thinking about your responses now. All right, very good. So please, dear Elsa, you're going to delight us with your response. You can please start doing so now. Yeah, shall we start again, dear Elsa? Yes.
In the lecture, have we presented in the in the lecture, we have been presented to the fascinating topic of the nature of the tragedy. The, the classic tragedy of literacy is more different than the normal one. In this kind of literacy, the characters performs with different emotion, and they feel their acting in very deep of their mind, and the audience experience is very different and more real. That's all. That was difficult for me.
Okay, very good. No, very good, Elsa. Thank you very much for your response. Great. Let us go with Claudia. Please, dear Claudia, you can respond now.
In this lecture, we have been presented with a fascinating topic of the nature of tragedy. Like the professor said, that classic tragedy is more than unfortunate acts that happen to people. Instead of that, the heroic character is struggling to find happiness, but they have to accept the responsibility of his downfall. And because of that, the audience can have a moment of catharsis. So the professor shows an example that is about Oedipus, that is a tale of Sophocles that is ambitious. He killed his father that was a king and married his mother. So yes, I don't have time.
Yes, very good. Anyways, thank you very much, Claudia. Great, very good response. Awesome, great. So let us start with some feedback. Well, great, Elsa. You know, this was a very interesting topic as well. In this case, the professor talked about Sophocles' tragedy, but of course, the main idea, let's say, of the entire lecture that he stated at the beginning was the nature of a real tragedy, right? That for Greek literature was not, as you said, our contemporary conception, but tragedy for the Greeks and also for these very ancient civilizations was actually a story that narrated the, let's say, the journey of somebody, a hero normally, that struggled to find happiness, but had a very fatal flaw that somehow allowed him to fall down, as you said as well. And well, later he has to recognize that, has to admit it, and has to somehow, well, remake his mistake, right? And that's how the audience feels some sort of catharsis. They feel very good and they feel, let's say, very much surprised and content because the hero recognizes this. Very good. Then the professor used here the example, right, of Sophocles' tragedy, that is to say, Oedipus, the tragedy of Oedipus. And well, the professor talked about Oedipus, a hero that is sent to Earth to find happiness. He sadly has a flaw, a very fatal flaw that is pride. He exhibits this by killing a man on his way to a city, and then he beats some sort of legendary creature, and the people of that city name him as the king of that city. And well, interestingly, he is somehow awarded by marrying the widow of that city, that in this case, well, the widow queen of that city, that he merits, certainly. And afterwards, the professor said some sort of plague came to the city, and Oedipus found out that the reason why God sent that plague was because of him, because apparently the man he killed on the road was his own father, and the mother, and his mother was the woman he married. So he recognizes his fault, etc., and of course, the audience feels a sense of catharsis, and that's how the professor exemplified this. And well, very good, dear Elsa. I think that, don't worry, we can, of course, the idea of catching all these things is listening once again to this type of material. And I'm going to send right now to the WhatsApp group a material that I prepared this afternoon for you, so that you can practice, okay, dear students, your listening of this type of material. Here I have it. Let me send it right now. It's a practice with several other lectures, okay, for you to, well, practice this, to listen to more of this type of material, and trust me, you're going to improve very much your listening and comprehension, okay? So there, I'm sending it, and very good, there you have it in order to practice, okay? And then also Claudia's response, very good. In this case, you managed to made a very good definition of what the professor explained at the beginning. Maybe you didn't have time to completely summarize the tragedy of Sophocles, Oedipus in this case. But as I say, it's a matter of measuring time. I know that you, of course, got the idea, you had it written on your paper, but of course we have to measure. We have to measure how much appropriate would be for us to talk about something, so that we can have time to talk about the rest, right? So as I say, it's a matter of measuring by practicing and practicing, and you measure, okay, I'm going to stop here, because if I don't stop, I won't have time to continue with the rest. So as I say, it's just measuring and measuring, and you can do that by practice. And I just sent you the material, so you guys can practice in your free time. And remember that last week I also sent more material. So with this, we're complementing. Okay, so you have a lot of material in order to practice this. And trust me, practicing is always the best manner to improve in this task. Okay, very good. So we're going to stop here. Your students, it was great. You have performed very well in those practices. So awesome. I'm going to take your assistance, okay, before you go. And please help me with your kind responses to the traditional poll as I do this. And if you have any question, commentary, you can please let me know, okay? And I'll look for you. Tomorrow, we're going to start with the writing section. Very much excited about that. We're moving into a different section. And of course, for you, that's a new experience, but trust me, it's going to be great. We're going to have a lot of time to practice as well this Friday. I know the writing section will be great for you. Okay, here we are. So we have Elsa Maria. Okay, thank you very much, Elsa. Yes, gotcha. Thank you very much. And we also had Claudia Hernandez.
Here.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. There you are, guys. Thank you for your kind responses to the poll. And well, we are just finalizing. And I see you tomorrow to start with the writing section. You can always send me a message if you want. And thank you very much. Okay, have a wonderful night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. See you.